With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sanhedrin Daf Samach Beis. We left off on Daf Samach Beis, Amud Aleph, 5 lines from the top of the Amud, as we are coming off the machlokes between Abaya and Rava regarding Ha'ovid, Avodah Zarah, Mi'ahava Oivihira. And as we're learning the Gemara, Keshitas Rashi and others, that we're speaking about someone who is doing a service to an idol, but they're doing it out of love or fear of another person. That here is where you have a machlokes. Abaya says chayiv and Rava says pater. So we'll see how this machlokes will relate to the following. Now the whole Daf Samach Beis is telling us that there was a certain brayso that Rabbi Zajac introduced in front of Rabbi Avraham, and when Rabbi Avraham heard it, he dismissed it. He says that this brayso is not authoritative. He, so to say, threw the brayso out of the besmedrash. Now, on Amud Aleph, Samach Beis Amud Aleph, there is one girsa of what that brayso is, and that was that's what Rabbi Zajac quoted from a brayso, that if a person did all of the 4 acts that we were speaking about, that even if you do them shaloi kedarka, the Mishnah Samach Amud Beis, you're going to be chayiv skila for Avodah Zarah worship, and that is zibech, kiter, nisach, and ishtachava, slaughtering, burning, pouring, which includes in it sprinkling blood and bowing down. What's going to happen if a person did it, what we call b'shoigeg behelam echad? So first of all, the rule is that any sin for which you're chayiv b'mezid kares, many sins you're chayiv kares and misas bezdin. And that's going to be the premise of the question, you're chayiv kares. And therefore, if a person serves avodah zarah b'shoigeg, you're going to be chayiv chatos. What happens if a person does 2 such activities, b'chlal, for any sin for which you chayiv chatos b'shoigeg? So the rule is to remember in Hilchos Shabbos, as we learn a lot more, it has to do with whether you did these 2 sins in one lapse of unawareness. It means while the person did not know, they did it once and they did it again, then they're only going to be chayiv 1 chatos when they became aware that what they did twice or thrice was awesome. If a person did an action for which you're going to be chayiv chatos, and they did it b'shoigeg, which is why they're chayiv chatos. But then they became aware that they did that sin b'shoigeg, let's say, and then they forgot that that is something that may not be done, and they did it again, then they're going to be chayiv 2 chatos. In other words, it is the lapse of awareness and then the subsequent awareness that will have a lot to do with how many karbanos chatos you bring. Indeed, when it comes to the Hilchos Shabbos, to the malachas of Shabbos, even if a person was in one lapse of unawareness, but they did different avos or told us of different avos, as we'll learn a lot about, then the person will be chayav for each one, even though they were done in one lapse of unawareness, even though they were done behelam achas. So the question is, how do we relate that when it comes to the isur of avodah zarah worship? So the brayso that Rav Zajac quotes says that if a person did all of the 4, they slaughtered, and they burned, and they poured, and they bowed, it was done behelam achas. Also, like we find by other Avedas, they're going to be chayiv only once. In other words, it's not going to be like Hilchos Shabbos. We're not going to separate them into 4 different Avedas. And Rabbi Avraham rejected that to the point that he says, the brayso should not be even taught on the Beis Medrash. So Samach Beis Amud Aleph is going to spend time understanding why couldn't Rabbi Avraham figure out how to make the brayso, yes, be authoritative. And that's going to link it somewhere during this discussion to the machlokes Abaya and Rava of Ha'ovid Avodah Zarah Mi'ava Oimeyira, that Abaya chayiv and Rava pater. And that Samach Beis Amud Beis is going to be another girsa of another brayso that Rav Zajac brought to the Beis Medrash that Rabbi Avraham threw out. We'll speak about that when we get to Amud Beis. And here also the Gemara is trying to figure out why couldn't Rabbi Avraham figure out a way to authenticate the brayso, not l'kula alma, but why do you have to say it's for sure corrupted? And that will also be linked to this machlokes of Abaya and Rava of Ha'ovid Avodah Zarah Mi'ava V'yira, Abaya chayiv and Rava pater. Through the sugya, we're going to learn something very interesting, that whenever you have a brayso, a Mishnah or a brayso Tana, teaching a halacha, there's a reisha and there's a seifa, and we know that sometimes when there is no other option, we say, the reisha goes according to one opinion, the seifa is going according to another opinion. It's definitely not ideal, but Rabbi Avraham felt that approach is a lot better then having the Braisa or the Mishnah follow one Shita, if you have to make the Reisha and the Seifa speaking about two different subjects, as we'll explain when we learn the Sugya, that's going to be a very important klal in the Derech HaLimud of Rabbi Yechon. So, Chevra, let's start. We already just spoke out this case on Samach Beis, Amid Aleph, 5 lines from the top of the Amid. Here we go. Tana, Rabbi Zakai. Rabbi Zakai and Amoira heard a Braisa that Rabbi Yechon never heard before. People did not hear about it before. He introduced it. And this is what the Braisa that he taught says. And he taught it, Kamei de Rabbi Yechon. That Zibach or Zibech, the Kited, the Nisach, the Hishtachavah, the person did the 4 different types of worships to Avodah Zarah, but it was done the Helam Ach Echad. The person was halachically considered a shoygeg. We'll work that out in a moment with greater detail, exactly where is that window of shoygeg, but if it was done with shoygeg. So one thing is for sure, that if a person was Zibech, v'Zibech, if it's done in one Helam Achas, for sure you're only going to be one. You're going to be chayv only one chatos when the person becomes aware that oy gavalti, we're over that Avodah Zarah Rachmana litzlan. Chiddush here is that even though the person did 4 different types of avodas, and let's say by Ilchas Shabbos, if a person who knew it was Shabbos but forgot about various Isurei Shabbos and did 2 different avos or 3 different avos, the Helam Achas, they're going to be chayav for each one. Here by Avodah Zarah, we don't say so. Eino chayav ela achas. Okay. And the reason for that would be, like Rashi brings down, because the Isur that includes all of these details are written in the Aseres HaDibros, where it says, Lo yisa'avim, do not worship idols. So since you have one lav that includes many details in it, it's all included in one lav, it's considered one chiyuv chatos. Taka behelam achas, chayv only chatos achas. And Amar Lei, when Rabbi Yechon heard this, he told Rav Zakai, Puk tane lebara. We don't kick people out, we're kicking ideas out. We're saying that this Braisa out, it cannot be that it's correct. And again, like we mentioned, the whole Amud Aleph will be, why not? Why can't we work it out? So, Amar Rabbi Abba, this is going to be a question against Rabbi Yechanan, that Hod Amar Rav Zakai, this what Rav Zakai said it makes sense. It should be a subject to the machlokes of Rabbi Yossi and Rav Nosson, which would mean that I understand why Rabbi Yechanan would not accept it halachically, but you can't kick it out. That's basically his point, because it would be consistent with one of the following 2 Tanaim. Where do we have the machlokes of Rabbi Yossi and Rav Nosson the Tanya? When it comes again to the Aseres HaDibros, just like we mentioned by Avodah Zarah, there is one general statement, Lo yisa'avim, that includes all of the different ways of worshiping idols. When it comes to violating Shabbos, the Torah also uses this general law. It says, Lo yisaseh kol malacha. Lo yisaseh kol malacha would have led us to conclude that if a person broke Shabbos, b'shoygeg, by doing different avos, or toldoisin of different avos, then they should also be chayiv only one chatos if they were done be'elam achas, but we don't say so. Really, you will see that subject to our machlokes. Why? Because in Parshas Vayakel, the Torah specifies one activity that may not be done on Shabbos, and that is lo yisavaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem. Don't kindle a fire. Question is, why did the Torah have to specify lo yisavaru eish when anyways we would have known that would be asur, because it would have been included in the lo yisaseh kol malach. So Rabbi Yossi holds havara lelav yotzah. A big chiddush. That havara, just like we said when we began the Masechta Shabbos, that Yitzias HaShabbos, that hoitzah is called a malach gerua. One can also argue that kindling a fire, which is something that's done almost effortlessly, is not considered something on the level of a malacha. And indeed, Rabbi Yossi holds that if a person, God forbid, kindles a fire on Shabbos, they're chayav alav, which means that if they do it b'meisiv, they're going to get malchus. But it's a sin for which there is no skila and there's no kadas, and therefore there's no chatas. You only chayav malchus. Oh, Nosson Omer, no, I disagree with Rabbi Yossi, and I hold that havara lechalek yotza. Lechalek means exactly what we're speaking about. That even though havara is one of the 39 malachas, it's considered a malacha for itself. Ubemela, if someone kindles a fire, let's say, and they plow, in the case where they did it b'shoigeg, you're going to be chayev achatos for havara, and it's not only about havara, but that's one of the Yud Gimel Midos, that since havara is considered its own malacha, it's teaching you, it's not only a din in itself, but it's teaching you for the rest of the breakings of Shabbos, for the malachos of Shabbos, that for each one you're chayiv another chatos. That's the source that if you did various avos, the helamachas, you'll be chayiv okolachas v'achas. So now suggests Rababa, and all of this again will be a kasha against Rabbi Yechon. Which is Rabbi Yossi. So here we have the same issue that even though the Torah writes in the Seres HaDibros lo yisa of them, nevertheless, as we'll begin the sugya and Daf Samach Gimel, that the Torah writes not once, not twice, but 3 times regarding Avodah Zarah, don't bow down to Avodah Zarah. Why was it written 3 times? So we're going to learn the next Daf, that one of the 3 times is to tell you, L'lav Yotz. Wow. L'lav Yotz would mean that let's read inside that Rashi. Rashi is like a middle of the Amid. Yishtachava is also, according to Rabbi Yossi, will be L'lav Yotz. I will learn Lekama and Basamach Gimel that Sholosh Yishtachava is Nemru Ba'azor Zaveris Kichamid. One is to tell you that even if it is Lisha Loiche Darko, if a person bowed down to an idol, even though this is not the way that people serve that idol, they're going to be chayiv. The azara minayin, you have to have in the Torah for Yidden, not only the punishment by avodah zarah, it's going to be skila, but also a pasuk that forewarns you. That's going to be the azara minayin tamolanu leisishtacham. The other one that Hashem writes it is l'chadarka, and we'll see details on that in Daf Samach Gimel. But the key here is on the third one, ba'achas l'chalek. L'chalek means just like bowing down is considered a service for itself, and Yechayiv for itself. Wow. So therefore, any other avodah that a person does, even though it's done behelam achas, Yechayiv for each one a separate chatos. Clearly not like the Tana of Rav Zajac. According to that, zibech v'kiter nisech v'ishtachma, even though they were done behelam achas, you'll be chayiv for chatos. However, suggests Rabbi Abba that the Braisa of Rav Zajac will not agree with that sugya. It will follow the Tana Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi won't interpret that the third Hishtachava is Lechalek, but it's to tell you that you're only Chayav Alav and not Kadis. Now, by the way, this is not saying that for the act of Hishtachava there should not be skila. There certainly should be skila if a person did it b'mezid. But only skila b'mezid if there was hasra. What happens if a person, God forbid, does ishtachava to an avodah zarah b'mezid without the proper hasra? Well, before learning this, then you'll say, oh, okay, you chayiv kadas. If a person does it b'shleigig, they're going to be chayiv chatas. The point of lelav yotza, mamish like we say by havara for Shabbos, it would mean that you're not chayiv kadas, that you're not chayiv achatos, even though if a person did it b'mezid with hasra, they'll be chayiv skill. Wow. So let's go back in the Gemara. In other words, if you're going to follow Rabbi Yossi, understanding that the Torah repeats alav, not to tell you lachalik, but to tell you lalav, then we're not machalik it. And that would be the author of the Braisa of Rav Zajac would follow that same approach, and therefore it would make sense that zibech v'kiter v'nisech v'ishtachava behelamachas you only chaybachas. However, the Gemara we're going to learn on Daf Samach Gimel, Amanda Amar Havara Lechalek Yotza, which then consistent with that taka, as we'll learn in the next Daf, Hishtachava Lechalek Yotza, which would be the reason why Rabbi Yechon doesn't have to accept the Braisa as halach. He'll reject it in, but it's very severe when you kick a Braisa out of the Beis Medrash. Why is it completely corrupted? So just a word, in other words, Rabbi Abba is making a statement which really is a kasha against Rabbi Yechon. Come on. Says the Gemara, the last narrow line on Daf Samach Beis. Maskiv lo Rav Yosef, this maskiv against Rabbi Abba will really be a teretz for Rabbi Yechon. I disagree with you, because I would counter argue Dilma Akal Kam Rabbi Yossi Hasam Havar Lalav Yotzam. Really, when the Torah repeats something, the default understanding is lachalik. Which is why Hishtachava, the third Hishtachava that Hashem writes regarding idol worship, that one may not bow down to it, L'chalik. L'chalik meaning that if a person did different actions of service to an idol, even though they were done the shregig, even though they were done the halamachas, they'll be chayav achatas for each one. Everyone will agree to that. Take the Brais of Rabbi Zakai and out of the Bismedish. Why does Rabbi Yossi by Hilchas Shabbos interpret that Havara is lalav yatsa? Because Rabbi Yossi knows the din of l'chalik from another source. Because Rabbi Yossi doesn't agree with the din that if a person does different avos on Shabbos, the shoygig, the helamachas, that you're chayv al kolachas v'achas, you are chayv al kolachas v'achas. But he already knows the nafkalei chiluk melachas. That's the chiluk melachas. If you do many melachas, even though they were done the helamachas, when you become aware you're chayv achatas for each one, he knows it from words that we find in Chumash Vayikra and Parshas Vayikra regarding the korban chatos. The Torah uses the words me achas mehena, as we'll see in a moment. And that's teaching you also concerning Shabbos. So in other words, if and when Rabbi Yossi already learns the din of chiluk melachos elsewhere, only then does he have the luxury to interpret Havara l'lav yatz. Even Rabbi Yossi would be moida that by avodah zara, as the Gemara will explain, that the chiluk avodos cannot be included in the ma'achas mehena. We don't know it yet. So the lav of ishtachava is lekula alma l'chalek yatza. L'chalek yatza means not like the brayso of Rabbi Zakai. That's going to be the answer. In other words, that brayso is definitely corrupted out of the Beis Medrash. Now the Tanya, what's the brayso from where that explains, that teaches us this limud of me'achas mehena? That Rabbi Yossi Omer, it says regarding chatos, that pasuk in Vayikra is not specifying which sin, but it's also speaking about, we'll see Shabbos, that if a person v'asa me'achas mehena, the person did one of them, he's chayiv chatos. The general introduction in the Chumash of chiyuv chatos. Now the Torah could have written v'asa achas. A person did one of the things that God said not to do. V'asa achas. What does the Torah write? V'asa me'achas mehena. So every single nuance will teach you a whole different thing. Says the Braisa, first of all, pa'amim shechayv achas al kulam, pa'amim shechayv al kolachas v'achas. There are times that you do one sin, that you do many sins, and you only chayv one chatos. There are times that you do many sins, and you'll be chayv chatos for each and every one. And v'amar Rabbi Yonasan, my Tama de Rabbi Yossi. Let's show you how we learned this from these words, and we're going to learn, like we said, many other dinim from these words as well, because it says v'asa ma'achas mehenam, and the Torah could have written v'asa achas. So first of all, achas means if a person did the entire sin, they're chayav, and there are times that even may achas, if they did part of the violation, they're also chayav chatas. The Gemara is going to give you an example. I'll say it just by heart. If a person writing on Shabbos is one of the lamates malachas. So, for example, if a person would write the name Shimon, chayiv chatos. That's achas. If they wanted to write and they wrote Shimon, the chayiv chatos. What happens if a person wrote the first two letters of Shimon, which is Shem? Shem has two letters. They're also going to be chayiv chatos, as we'll review in a moment. Halachas from Shabbos. So there's achas, and sometimes you chayiv chatos, even if it is meyachas. Another day, heina mehena. Heina mehena means that if you did them, right? Or if you did something that is explicitly written in the Torah not to do, that's heina. Mehena means if I did something that was not written explicitly in the Torah, still you're going to be chayiv achatas, like we have in Hilchos Shabbos. The toldos are, so to say, not mentioned. Nevertheless, if a person only violated one tolda, they're chayiv the punishments biblically as you are for the others. The person is going to be chayiv chatas if they did it b'shoigim. And now what's negaya to us? There are times that there is one that is equal to them, one for them, and one times them for one. What's the them for one? What's the them for them? That's going to be connected to the lachalik yotza, as the Gemara will explain. The Gemara is going to explain every line. Achas, meyachas means a person wrote Shimon. B'shoigeg b'chayv chatos. Meyachas, you only did some of it, not all of it. If you only wrote the letters Shin Mem from the name Shimon, writing two oisias as we live in Shabbos is also a violation on a biblical level of thou shalt not write. Hey, when a person violated something that's explicitly not allowed to be done, that refers to violating avos in Shabbos. Mehena means even if a person only violated the tuldam, they're going to be chayv chatos. That's toldos. Now, achas shehina, if a person sometimes, right, there is one that becomes many. One that becomes many refers, that's lachalik. If a person knew at Shabbos, that's called Zodain Shabbos. But they forgot that you can't plow, they forgot that you can't cook. And they did both. The Shiga goes malachas, and then they become aware, you can't do this and you can't do that. They're going to be chayv tu chatos. That's the lachalik. Even though really they did both chilul, acts of chilul Shabbos behela ma'achas, but it's considered separated. And heino she'achas, there are other times that a person can violate, God forbid, many malachi Shabbos, but only be chayv one chatos, and that is if it was shigugay Shabbos and Sodoin malachas, as we learned in Hilchos Shabbos, in Masechta Shabbos, that if a person knows that on Shabbos he can't plow, he knows on Shabbos he can't cook, he forgot today is Shabbos. There was one thing that he forgot, and if he would be reminded of that one thing, he wouldn't do the many things that he did. Then he's only chayv one chatos. If a person knew that it's Shabbos, but he forgot that he can't plow, he also forgot that he can't cook. It means there were two things that he forgot. He would have to be reminded of two things for him not to do whatever he did. Then he's chayv tu chatos. Bottom line is that ma'achas meheno also teaches you that for Shabbos, if you did various malachas behelamachas, even though you did the behelamachas, you're chayiv al kolachas ve'achas. So again, says Rabbi Yosef, so since the lachalik is already learned from a achas mehena, that's why Rabbi Yosef uniquely, exclusively will learn the lav of havara only the lavios. We don't have such a limit from any other place. So lakula alma, therefore everyone, as we'll learn in the Samach Gimel, will agree that the third lav of Yishtachava is lachalik yatsa. No one will disagree with that. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan was just in throwing the Braisa out of the base bench. Asks the Gemara, hold on. The pasuk that we just quoted in Parshas Vayikra doesn't speak about Shabbos, doesn't speak about any specific Haveda. It's the introduction generally to a carbon chatois. So why don't we say that that same Braisa, that same pasuk, the Ma'achas Mehena, is also telling you, is also teaching you concerning Avodas Kochavim. Now, by the way, that's not going to fadenfer Rabbi Yochanan. That's not going to be a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, because if ma'achas mehena is being machalik malachas, so here again you will disagree, and you would hold that zibech v'kita v'nisach v'ishtachava yachayv al kolachas v'achas. We just want to understand that why did he say that the lav of ishtachava is going to be the source that machalik malachas? Why don't we learn it directly from the Braisa? To say, and I can touch every line in the Braisa for it. Achas, if a person violated the entire malacha, the entire avoida, the chayiv, chatos, that will be if a person sheds. May achas would mean part of it. Another here, the example would be by Shabbos, it's shame from Shimon. By avodah zara, it will be if a person cuts one of the two pipes, one of the two simanim. You have the esophagus and the trachea, kiyadua. And if a person even only severs one, he should also be chayiv chatos. He didn't sever the whole thing, and he plans to do so. In middle, he chapped oy gevalt. It's avodah zara because it says meyachs, heina, and mehena. Heina would be avos. What are the avos? Look at these words. What we're learning right now, right? That's beginning with the Mishnah Samach, zibuach and kitur and nisuch and ishtachavo. Mehena regarding avodah zara would mean what will be a tolda, toldois, sheven, malkan lefanel. Wow, if a person takes a stick and they break the stick in front of the idol as a avodah. So it's interesting, just like zibuach is breaking the neck. So any avodah zara worship that has to do with breaking anything for the idol is called the tulda of zibuach. And that's a big chiddush. That would mean that even if that's not kedarka, it's shaloi kedarka, but it's considered like zibuach, and the person will be chayv anyways. So it fits. You can have an av and a tulda by avodah zara. And furthermore, why don't we say the same limit over here? Achashi heina would refer. When would you bring many chatois? When zudoin avodas kichavim, a person knows that you cannot serve idols. He just didn't know that this is called service. V'shiga gas avodas, mamish like Shabbos. Again, this would contradict the Braisa of Rav Zakai, but it would be learned from the Ma'achas Mehena, and Heino Shi Achas even would be Shigagas Avodas Kechavim Uzudaina Shigas Avodas Kechavim Uzudaina Avodas, that the person did not know, right? The person did not know that Bachlal you can't serve an idol, but he knew this is called a Avodah. Okay. Now again, this is not going to be a kasha on Rabbi Yechanan, but this will just be a question. Why are we saying that the Ma'achas Mehena doesn't also apply to Avodas Kechavim? And this should be the source that we are going to be chayiv for chatois, right, by Zibech, Kita, Nisach, and Ishtachavo. Now, what would be this case, mamish, like we had at the end of the last year? What would be a scenario where you have Shigagas Avodas Kechavim? That means you don't know that you may not worship idols, and that's a problem. Look inside the Rashi, 8 lines before the bottom of the Amid. How can you even suggest that the pasuk in Vayikra is regarding idol worship? There is no such case where you have Shigagas Avodas Kechavim when there is Zudoin Avodos, and therefore that's why we can't learn it from here. That's why we are suggesting that everyone will learn it from the third extra Lois Ishtachava. Now, the Gemara speaks out. Again, we're repeating the same back and forth that we had at the end of the last year. If we're speaking about a scenario where someone thought that he's in a shul for God, and he bowed down there, and then he found out that it was an Avodah Zarah room, then it's not called Avodah. It's not called an act of Avodah Zarah. He did nothing wrong. Furthermore, Ella, if a person saw that there was an andarta, there was a statue, and he thought that it's a statue made to be machabe the person, which is something to which we are allowed to bow down to, and the person decided like he bowed down to it, and then he discovered that it was an idol. Again, it's not even called a shoygig. It's b'chlal not a sin, because if when he bowed down, no matter what the statue was made for, if he was being makabel on himself that image as his god, then he's mazid. It's not a shoygig. If he did not accept that image to be his getchke, he only bowed down l'shem kibud for covet. There's not a problem at all. Like kluma. Where do you have the shoygig scenario? Ella, now this is the link to our sugya, like we mentioned in the intro of ha'oived avodas kechavim ava meira. Ella be ahava meira. Well, ava meira, and that would be the case of a shoygig. Ava meira would means that he was aware that he's bowing down. He knew that he's bowing down to an avodah zarah. Elama, he thought that since his intention is not to worship it, his intention is only to be nice to someone who he loves, or to get away from the fear from someone else who might hurt him if he won't do it. He thought that that's something that you could do. That's what he thought. But the emes, you can't, which is why we're calling it a shoygig. The emes we can't is only la'abaya. So hanicha la'abaya, indeed, that says that you are really chayiv. Shoygig means he didn't know that you're chayiv. He thought that you're pater. But according to Rava, the emes is that you're pater. And with Rava, the Amr pater, ma'ikala meimar, it cannot be this case. Elo, another suggestion, that the person thought mutter, that b'chlal, there is no isur to worship idols. That's the shoygig. He didn't know that it's usur to worship idols. And for that, we are saying that in such a scenario, the limit of ma'achas mehena would be that if a person did many actions, many avodos, they'll only be chayiv achas, if that would be the interpretation. Now I have a new question. Why is that? Why don't we resolve the inquiry that Rava asked of Rav Nachman? So as we just learned, going back a couple of lines by Hilchas Shabbos, that when do we say that if a person violated many avos, even though they were behelamachas, when he becomes aware of what he did, he's going to be chayiv al kol achas va'achas. That's only when there was doing Shabbos. He knew it's Shabbos, but he forgot regarding each and every one of the malachas. If a person knew that on Shabbos you can't do this and that and the other, he simply forgot today is Shabbos, then he's only going to be chayiv one chatas. So the boya that the Rava asked, what happens if a person did not know that it's Shabbos and he didn't know regarding each and every one of the Hilchas Shabbos? And now he became aware. But when he became aware, he looks back and he did all the 39 malachas. Is he chayv achas or is he chayv all the 39? Because there was both Helen, there was both a shogeg regarding the malachas, and there was a shogeg regarding Shabbos. Now that question remained unanswered. Why don't we answer it from over here? If we're going to interpret this brayso, that it's also referring to avodah zarah. And from here we learn the concept of chiluk malachas, which goes against the brayso of Rav Zachac. But for that you have to learn every single stanza fitting avodah zarah. And this is going to be the case of shigigas avodah zarah, shigigas avodas kechavim, dizodoin avodas. If it's bo'aymen muter is mamish halam zavazeh. Or bo'aymen muter means the person doesn't know that there is b'chal and isur of worshiping idols, and therefore he doesn't know that any one of the actions is considered a problem. It goes together. And if on this we're going to say that you're only chayiv one, so why won't this brayso be used to be poished the boya that Rabbi asked Rav Nachman? The fact that no one used this brayso is a raya that this brayso cannot be referring to avodas kechavim. The Gemara says that's not correct. Holei kasha, because no, this brayso might also be applied to avodas kechavim, and taka, this brayso should be used and could be used and will be used to answer the inquiry that if it's helam zevazeh ein rechayv alachas. So where are we at right now? Again, Rabbi Yochanan is good that he kicked the brayso out, but when we are trying to say that, why don't we say that the brayso is following Rabbi Yossi? Because Rabbi Yossi will use the lois ishtachave to teach you that it's lechalek yotza. No, learn the lechalek yotza from the brayso. But the Gemara concludes in emes is nishtazon. The pasuk in Vayikra, this is Vayikra Perek Dalet pasuk Beis, cannot be speaking about the shogeg of idol worship. I'll tell you why. Because in Vayikra, you open up the Chumash, when the Torah introduces chatos, the Torah separates different people a chayv, a different type of chatos. And those differences are true concerning all isurim for which a chayv chatos, other than avodas kechavim. For some reason, the Oivishter put all of the chatois of avodas kechavim got in Parsha Shlach, not here in Vayikra, in Chumash Bamidbar. And we don't have these differences. The Ilu Hacha here in Vayikra, there was a type of carbon that has to be brought by a Moshiach, meaning the Kohen Gadol. Not any Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Gadol that became a Kohen Gadol because he was anointed with the Shem and HaMishkan. And if he is over on a sin for which he's chayiv achatos, so the animal type has to be a part. If a Nasi, the king, God forbid, if he's over on a sin for which he's chayiv achatos, he brings a chatos, but he brings a higot. And biyachid, as it says befedish, so the animal has to be either a kizba or a seira, a female goat, a female shepsela. But the evil of avodas kechavim, so that's Vayikra. By avodas kechavim, again, we know explicitly from Chumash Bamidbar, Vishavin shebeseira kayachid, that they all bring the same type of she goat, a seira, is a raya that the entire Parsha of Vayikra is not speaking about the sin of idol worship. So avade, the brayso of achas me'achas, explaining all of the nuances of that pasuk, is not referring to avodas kechavim, because the entire Parsha in Vayikra is dafka not referring to avodas kechavim. And now the Gemara says there's nothing else to add. So bottom line is that Rabbi Yochanan stands just, and not only does he stand just, but even though there is a Tana Rabbi Yossi that when it comes to Hilchas Shabbos tells you that the lav of Havara is only l'lav yotza and not l'chalak yotza, the only reason why the Tana Rabbi Yossi does it is because he already knows l'chalak yotza from achas me'achas. Ma she'en ken by avodas kechavim. The achas me'achas is dafka not speaking about avodas kechavim. Avodas kechavim, the sin is not mentioned in Chumash Vayikra in the beginning over there in Perek Dalet. Therefore, even Rabbi Yossi will be moida that the third lois ishtachava, like Rab Nosson by Shabbos, is l'chalek yotza. L'chalek yotza, bottom line, will mean that Rabbi Yochanan stands strong. That if a person did 4 different avodos, God forbid, to an avodah zarah, even though they were done by helamachas, l'chalek yotza. Lois ishtachava tells you you're chayv only for ishtachava, and it's not only ishtachava, but it tells you l'klal kula yotza, that all the other actions that one may not do, even though you did them, okay. Akan, version number 1, and now the last line in the Amid, Samach Beis Amud Aleph, is version number 2. Ki asa Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda Amar, when he came to Bavel, he came from Eretz Yisrael, he learned about this whole topic that Samach Beis Amud Beis, and he says, yeah, you guys have it right. I remember Rabbi Zajac came into the Beis Medrash and he taught us a new Braisa. Rabbi Yechanan heard it and he says, Arois. But it was a whole different Braisa. Hachi Tanakame. This is the Braisa that Rabbi Zajac taught, that Rabbi Yechanan kicked out. Now listen to this Braisa. Braisa writes, Chomer b'Shabbos b'Shar mitzvahs. That in one area Shabbos is more chomer than other mitzvahs. And Chomer b'Shar mitzvahs mi b'Shabbos. And in another area, other mitzvahs are considered more stringent than Shabbos. Explains the Braisa. Chomer b'Shabbos, where do we find the Chumra in Shabbos? That Shabbos also shtayim behelam echad chayv al kol achas v'achas ma she'en ken b'shar mitzvahs. As we just learned on Amud Aleph, that there are times during Shabbos shigegas malacha, even though it was behelam achas, person will be chayv for every single av that they violated. Now, what's the meaning of ma she'en ken b'shar mitzvahs? That's exactly the problem that we're going to face in a moment. So let's shelve that. The Gemara will explain or attempt to explain what that might mean. And then the Braisa continues that Chomer b'Shar mitzvahs over Shabbos is Shabbos mitzvahs shogag b'loy mischav. The person did something completely without intent. You didn't even intend to do that act. That's called misasik. You were preoccupied. So the din then would be that you're chayiv. One example we'll have in a moment. A person, there was chaylev, which may not be consumed. It was liquefied. Some of it was in one's mouth, but they thought it's their own saliva. So when they swallowed it, it's not that they didn't know that you can't eat chaylev. They did not intend to eat. Swallowing one's own saliva is not called an act of eating. That's called misasik. Nevertheless, the halacha is that if the person swallowed that and then they became aware that it was chaylev, they're chayiv to bring a chatos. Masha'en Kenan Shabbos, misasik is completely exempt. It's not even considered a shoygig. The example we're going to have is that we're not allowed to rip something out of the ground. Now, we're not even speaking about a person that forgot that you can't be toilish. There was something on the ground that the person thought was already disconnected. They just wanted to pick it up. They did not even intend to do the act of toilish, just to lift. Turned out that that item was still connected to the ground. That's just an example again. It's not that you did not know you can't do it on Shabbos. It's not that you didn't know that at Shabbos. You didn't even intend to do the act. That on Shabbos is not even a shoygig. So here you see where Shar Mitzvahs is more chomer over Shabbos. Now we have to explain that first scenario where we have a chomer, right? That Shabbos is more chomer than other mitzvahs. By Shabbos you're chayv al kol achas v'achas, and by Shar Mitzvahs you're not. What does that mean? What will be the case? Chomer b'Shabbos, Shabbos also shtayim chuli, like we explained. So, what case of Shabbos are you chayv al achas v'achas? You did two different malachos. You harvested and you did grinding. Behelamachas. And by the way, that's the din. That's the din according to Rab Nosson. That's going to be the din that we learned from Lav of Havara. According to Rabbi Yossi, also, lachalik, we're going to learn it from achas me'achas, which would work. But what would be the contrast? The contrast would not work. The Kabbalah mitzvahs, what would be the case of other mitzvahs? That if a person ate both chaylev and dam, not knowing that you can't eat chaylev, not knowing that you cannot eat dam, what, here you're going to be chayv only one? It's not true. If a person violated two different lavim, of course they're going to be chayv for each and every lav, even though it was done by helamachas. There is absolutely no difference. Elo must mean gabi shar mitzvahs the ein chayv ala achas echidamim. That will be that if a person ate a kazayis of chaylev and they ate another kazayis of chaylev. Now, if in between these two achilos they became aware, then they have to bring a chatos for each and every one. But behelamachas, while they are still in the same lapse of I forgot you can't eat chaylev, they ate two to achal chaylev v'chaylev, which is why Taki only chayv one chatos. The problem is that even by Shabbos, if a person is violating the same av, 2 times, 3 times, the helamachas, they will also only be chayvachas. The chavas agav Shabbos, the avad what ktsira, and then half an hour later, or whatever the time later, he did another act of ktsira. Problem is, you're not chayv too. Hachinami chadam chayev, hachi chadam chayev. So there is no difference. And indeed, says the Gemara, because of that stanza not working, that's why, according to the second version, when Rabbi Yochanan heard the Tana, the Braisa that Rav Zachac brought in, he kicked out the Braisa. Beautiful. You don't kick out a person, you kick out the idea. That's why he told Rav Zachac, Tana lebara, go teach the Braisa belongs outside, doesn't belong in the basement. And mamish, like we had on Amud Aleph, the Gemara is going to try to reconcile that this Braisa should fit at least according to someone, which would pose a question against Rabbi Yochanan, and that would link, now again, the link of our big original topic, Abaye and Rava, we'll see how this will be part of the issue. Why was it so impossible? Why was it so impossible to make this Braisa be authenticated? Dilma maybe, the Abad, Ketzira Utchina, 2 different Avos, which is Takawai Chayiv to Chatois, but Masha Enkein B'Shana mitzvahs would not be speaking about other mitzvahs like Achal Chelev and Chelev. Maybe that would be referring specifically to Avodas Kichav. What? How does that fit into it? So it's amazing. According to the version of Amud Beis, we don't have the Braisa that we learned on Amud Aleph. Braisa meaning a Tanam, that if a person was Zibech, V'Kiter, V'Nisach, V'Yishtachava, Yechayv only Achas. But Lokula Alma, the Amoida Rav Ami, and we're going to have this on Daf Samach Gimel, makes exactly this statement. By the way, this statement, according to Amud Aleph, was completely rejected. But let's follow this version. That what Rav Ami says, Amar Rav Ami Zibech, V'Kiter, V'Nisach, V'Helam Achas, Eino Chayv Ala Achas, Eino Chayv Ala Achas. Accepting Rav Ami's statement, we can explain the Braisa that we have on top of the Amid. Correct. On Shabbos, if you did 2 different avos, you're chayiv al kol achas v'achas. Masha enkin b'shar mitzvahs would mean that if the person in one lapse of unawareness, they knew you can't worship idols. They didn't know that slaughtering is called an act of worship. They also didn't know that bowing is called an act of worship. And they did both. According to Rav Ami, like we had on Amud Aleph, from Atana, here it's an Amoida, you're chayiv only one. So it fits. So the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Yochanan couldn't have understood it that way. Why not? Because since the Tani Sefer, as we just quoted about the second clause of the Braisa, that Chomer b'shar mitzvahs, sheb'shar mitzvahs, it's shogeg b'loy mischavin. If you did something like we explained, an example, you swallowed chayla. In other words, you were preoccupied. You did not even intend to the act. Let me just give you a good example by Shabbos. Creating electricity, we paskin is asum midoy raisa. What happens if a person, when they walk by a door place where the switches are, mamash, their shoulder can knock the light on or off. That will be a great case of masasik. They're not even chayv chatas, but they didn't even intend to do it. So if the Braisa is speaking about Avodas Kichavim, that would mean that the Sefer that says that Chomer b'shar mitzvahs, that Shogag b'loy mischavin, your chayiv, is also speaking about Avodas Kichavim. Now we got to figure out how that's even possible. So the Gemara says, how is that possible? Shogeg b'loy mischavin, Avodas Kichavim, you didn't even intend to do an act of worship, and that's called a shogeg, not a mazid. Heichadamim. And for the third and final time, all these scenarios which point out that there are certain actions or activities that externally might even look like someone is worshiping an idol, that's b'chlal not avodas kechavim. Because if a person, let's say, was in a church, which is an idol worship sanctuary, but the person thought they were in a Jewish Beis HaKnesses, and they bow down over there, b'chlal, there's no aveda. Because liboy la shamayim. If another can, we're trying to figure out what's the case of a shogeg b'loy mischab. If the person chazal andarto, he saw a statue, and v'sagedle, and he bowed down to the statue. So again, what will be the shogeg b'loy mischabin? Ikabli alei be'eloha. If he imbued, if he thought, had this illusion that there's some divine power in the statue, that's not only not shogeg b'loy mischabin, that's not even shogeg. That's amazing. If he only, he knew what he's doing, but he had respect. He thought it's a statue made for respect, and he bowed down to show respect. That's b'chlal not a problem. It's not called shoygig b'loy mischaven. It's nothing. It's not b'chlal avodah zarah. Ella, again, the solution would be if you follow Abaya. That's the link to our sugya. Again, that if a person knew that you can't serve an idol. A person thought that if you bow down to an idol, not because you're makabel that for a god, but only from the love or a fear of someone else who wants you to do it, the person thought that it's not a problem. But really it is. That's why it's called the shoygig. That statement is only true Abaya. So Ella, it must be that the act of shoygig was mi'avo me'yira. So again, hanichal Abaya, that holds that the emes you're chayiv. Shoygig will mean I didn't know that you're chayiv. But according to Rava, that the emes you're pater, that cannot be the case. And the only final solution would be ba'omer muter. Was a person b'chlal did not know that you can't worship idols. And on that, the Braisa is saying that you're chayiv, but by Shabbos you're pater. That's also not true. Masha'enkim is Shabbos, the pater legamri. Nish emes. Because at kan loy boyim in a Rava mirav Nachman helem zevazeh ela ilacha yuvichada ilacha yuvitarte. As we quoted in Amud Aleph, just put the chazering. We don't always say that if a person did many malachi Shabbos, mehalamachas, the chayav al kolachas va'achas, that's only if there was Zudoin Shabbos, Shigigas Malach. If it was Shigigas Shabbos, they knew that on Shabbos you can't do this and you can't do that. They didn't know what Shabbos. And in that lapse of unawareness, they did many others to only Chayvachas. Rava then asked Rav Nachman, what happens if the person both did not know what Shabbos, nor did he know the various malachas? Now that inquiry, making that clear, is not speaking about Nesasik. There the question is, are you chayiv for each one, or are you chayiv only one? But for sure, you're not going to be completely exempt. In other words, ba'omer muter by avodas kechavim, and not knowing that it's Shabbos, and not knowing that on Shabbos you can't do malachas would be the ba'omer muter of avodas kechavim. So it doesn't work in the Braisa, because you can't tell me that by avodas kechavim you're chayiv, but by Shabbos you're pater. By Shabbos you're not pater. You are, in best case scenario, you're only chayiv achas. In other words, the question is maybe even more. So therefore, the Braisa's seifa cannot be speaking about avodas kechavim. So therefore, the Braisa's reisha cannot be speaking about avodas kechavim. So this statement that chomer Shabbos b'shar mitzvahs doesn't work. Since it doesn't work, Rabbi Yochanan told the Rav Zakai, get this out of my bismedj. Now, final attempt, which will be a kasha against Rabbi Yochanan, my kushya. What was bothering Rabbi Yochanan? Why don't we say Dilma la'olam malach? Reisha is speaking about avodas kechavim. Taken it works, and on that we say chomer b'Shabbos b'shar mitzvahs. This is all based on Avani. However, the sefer, you're right. The sefer cannot be speaking about the omer muter. The sefer is going to be speaking about, like we mentioned when we began learning this Braisa, b'shar mitzvahs. And Shagag B'lei Mischaven would be the Kasava Roiku Ubaloi, a person not Chalev, like we mentioned, eating Chalev, Isur Kadas, eating Chalev B'Shoigeg Chayiv Chatas. Here the person didn't even know they're eating. They thought it was their saliva because the Chalev was melted in their mouth. Nevertheless, the din is, even though they didn't even know they're doing the act of eating, they're Chayiv Chatas. Masha'enken the Shabbos, the Pater. If you didn't even know you're committing the act, it's not that you didn't know you can't do it. You didn't even have intention for the action. For example, you thought something is already disconnected laying on the ground. You bent down not to uproot anything, just to lift something. Turned out, the chatach, the hatoch as a mechubar, and you ended up uprooting tzira, something that was really connected. By Shabbos, you're completely exempt. And like Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel explained, what will be the base of the difference? That Hamasasik Bechalovim Ubaroyes, if a person completely preoccupied, without even knowing that they're doing an act, if it's an act of eating, or an act of Aroyos, they're going to be Chayv Achatos. And he explained why. Because you have Hana'ah when the person swallowed the Calif, they didn't think they're swallowing Calif. They thought they're swallowing their saliva, but it gave them hana'ah. However you'll interpret hana'ah. They enjoyed it, or it's going to give them the nutrients of Calif. There's hana'ah. Masha'enken by Shabbos, there's something unique, which is lekula by Shabbos, is that what type of malacha does the Eibishter prohibit? This is a big statement. Meleches machsheves asrotoyim. There has to be a minimum amount of mindfulness for a person to be connected to their action concerning Shabbos. Hamasasik the Shabbos spotted because meleches machsheves asur. So here we're back to the kasha. Why did Rabbi Yechanan kick the Brais of Rav Zajac out of the Beis Medrash? You're right that the Seifa cannot be referring to Avodas Kechavim, but why don't we say that the Reisha and the Seifa are speaking about two different scenarios, two different subjects? The Reisha is speaking about Avodas Kechavim, based on Shitas Rav Amai, it will work, and the Seifa is speaking about other things, Calif. So this is a kasha on Rabbi Yechanan. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yechanan did not accept that possibility because that's Rabbi Yechanan Latame. That's the derech halimud of Rabbi Yechanan. He doesn't allow, he doesn't accept, he's not open to having one brisa or one mishnah and to make it work by explaining that the Reish is speaking about one subject, the Seif is speaking about another subject. Rabbi Yechanan rejects that possibility. Now, we do find relatively often that the Reisha follows one Tana, the Sefer follows another Tana. Rabbi Yechanan accepts that. That's also not ideal, because why wouldn't Rabbeinu HaKadosh or the compiler of the Braisa write Befedish, this is the Shita, Divrei, this Tana, Divrei, the other Tana, but it could be. But to say that the Braisa is following one Tana, one Shita, and in one flow, it's changing subjects. That's something that Rabbi Yechanan rejects. And where do we find that? That will be the final din that we learn in this daf. The Amar Rabbi Yechanan, we're going to Bava Metzia, to Perek HaMafkid, daf mem. It's a very simple case. Rashi goes through the case. Let's go by heart. A person. First, there is a mafkid. There is someone who entrusts their article to a custodian, to a shomer. Now, the halacha will be that if the custodian, if the shomer becomes a ganef, which means his responsibility is to guard it. He's not a borrower. He has no right to use it. The moment the custodian takes that article, he has a din of a ganef. Din of a ganef would be is that what would happen after, even if something happens to that article, completely out of the power of the custodian, now ganef, he's going to be chayiv to give back the value to the owner. So what happens if the custodian takes that article for himself, but then he puts it back down? Do we consider the act of putting it back down to be returning the gzela? He did tshuva. Now he reverts again to be a custodian. And then if something were to happen to that article, he can go back to being exempt. Now there is a machlekes tanoim between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva regarding theft and regarding the mitzvah of returning that which you stole, whether you have to notify the owner that you returned it. Amazing. Rabbi Yishmael holds, it's called loy tzarich das balam, that if a person, God forbid, is a ganef or a gazlan, but they do tshuva and they give back the article, even if they were ashamed to give it back, but they go at night and they put it in the property of, they returned it without the knowledge of the owner. Rabbi Yishmael holds that's called return. Rabbi Akiva says, no, returning the gzela is only called returning when you notify the owner that you returned the article, either by giving it to him or by letting him know that you put it in his property. Now, the final detail that we have over there, the Mishnah in Perek HaMafkid on Daf Mem, is that there was a Reisha and a Seifa. And you know what? Let's read inside Rashi, like probably 10 lines before the end of the narrow lines. Rashi goes through the case over there. The Tanan and Perek HaMafkid. Chavias, Eitzel, HaMafkid, Chavias, Eitzel, Chavias. This final nuance. The owner who entrusted the custodian with a keg of wine, case number one is that the owner of the house did not designate a place where that barrel will be guarded, which means that the entire house could be used to hold that barrel. And then, like we mentioned, the owner first moved it. And then afterwards he put it back down. And then the barrel broke. So if he moved it because he felt that the barrel is not protected in the corner that it was originally put, he moved it to protect the barrel, and he's never called a ganav. We're speaking about a custodian that's not chayiv in such a circumstance. But the Mishnah there writes that if the owner moved it l'tzar choy, even if he didn't want to drink the wine, but he wanted to use it as a ladder, the moment I, as a custodian, take your article for me, halachically, I'm called a ganav. So the Mishnah there writes, when I put it back down, I'm going to be chayiv. In other words, putting it back down. No. The Braisa says if when I put it back down, I'm patur. When the owner was not miyachid makom, no matter where I put it back down, so to say, it's like I returned it. So when I put it back down, even though I took it wrongfully, I'm considered a gazlin or a ganif. When I put it back down, I returned it, and now that it broke, I'm going to be patur. Reisha. The Seifa adds that if the owner did designate a place for this keg of wine, and the person then put it back down, you're going to be chayiv. Says Rabbi Yechanan, what's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? What difference will it be if the owner was miyachid makim for the barrel, or if the owner was not miyachid makim? So Rabbi Yechanan explains is that the case of the Seifa, the whole Braisa, he says that we're speaking about Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. The Reisha follows Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel holds that Ein Tzarech Das Bailin. When you put it back down, it's considered returned. Since you returned it, you no longer consider that ganif. In the case where your level of custodianship is not machayev you for such a scenario, you'll be exempt. Seifa follows Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds Tzarech Das Bailin. So therefore, even though you put it back down, you still call it ganif. That's why you're going to be chayev. That's what Rabbi Yechanan. Reisha Rabbi Shmuel, Seifa Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara asks on Rabbi Yechanan, why do you have to do that? Why didn't you say that in the Seifa, and why did the Mishnah have to mention that the owner designated the place in the Seifa? What difference would that mean? So the Gemara there says, I'll tell you why. Because if the owner was miyachid makom, and the custodian did not put it back in that location, even according to Rabbi Yishmael, it's not called returned, because I did not put it in that location. Gemaldik. Which would be a much better solution, because like this, the Mishnah can be following Rabbi Yishmael. Why does Rabbi Yechanan reject that understanding? Because Rabbi Yechanan does not allow for you to interpret a Mishnah where the Reisha is speaking about a case that you returned it, no matter where you returned it. If the owner did not designate a location, wherever you put it back, that's called its location. If the Seifa is speaking about a case, as it says b'fedish, that you were meyachad makim, but you did not put it back in that makim, that's a different case. Reisha, you put it back in its makim. Seifa is you did not put it back in its designated place. That's called two different subjects. And Rabbi Yechanan would rather interpret a Mishnah that Reisha Rabbi Yishmael, the Seifa Rabbi Akiva, than interpreting that Mishnah following only Rabbi Yishmael, but the Reisha and the Seifa is speaking about two different subjects. The same thing will be over here. Rabbi Yechanan L'Shitase will not allow you to interpret the Reisha and the Seifa. One case it's about Avodah Zarah. Shar Mitzvahs is referring to Avodah Zarah. In the other case, Shar Mitzvahs is not referring to Avodah Zarah. That's why he kicked the Braisa out of the Beis Medrash. Let's read it inside. The Amar Rabbi Yechanan, that Rabbi Yechanan said, it must be the Mishnah Namafkid is Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. It cannot follow Rabbi Shmuel. Because again, like we said, if that would be the case, then the Reisha and the Seifa is speaking about halachically, in the Reisha, you put it back in its designated place. In other words, since a place was not designated, the entire house is its designated place. And the Seifa is where you did not put it back in its designated place. He doesn't accept that. And therefore he says, Man the Makadim Lichadis, whoever can explain the Mishnah of Barrow, Aliba the Chatana, that it should only follow one Tana, only Rabbi Shmuel, I will be so impressed that I will become his servant, his server, and I'm going to carry his clothing when he goes into the bathhouse, because I don't see how that can be done. And again, that's all because he rejects the possibility of Reisha and Seifa all in different subjects, which is why Rabbi Yechanan threw this Braisa out of the Beis Medrash. We'll stop over here, God willing, to be continued. Give me a 2-minute break over here, and shortly we will start Daf Samach. All right. Well, Heather, we're going to have an amazing daf right now. Compared to the last one, also very easy. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sanhedrin Daf Samach Gimel. We left off on Daf Samach Beis, Amid Beis, the last word in the bottom of the Amid. We're going to begin today's daf quoting what we learned in the last daf, B'Shem Rav Ami. Also, according to one version, the Braisa that Rav Zajac taught to Rabbi Yechanan, or in front of Rabbi Yechanan, that Zibech or Zibach and Kited and Nisech, all Behelam Echad, if a person did 3, in our case, acts of idol worship service, but they did it in all one lapse of unawareness, they didn't know that this may not be done, and then they discovered that indeed this is called a avoida to a idol, they're only going to be chayiv one chatos. We don't say what we say, for example, in Shabbos, that if a person broke various avois, even though it was done by halamachas, by Shabbos, they will be chayiv for each and every one a chatos. We're going to go back to the Mishnah on Samach Amid Beis that says that if someone only says Eli Ato, they say words that you are my God to an idol, they are already chayev misa, even though they didn't yet serve that idol. We're going to have here the machloikes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim concerning someone who's megadev, blaspheming, that Rabbi Akiva holds that if a person is megadev, b'shoigeg the chayev chatos, and the Chachamim hold that he's not going to be chayev chatos, because to be chayev chatos you have to do an act in violation of God's command. And megadev, which is taka words, sometimes we say that akimas sufasov havamaisa, not concerning over here, it's a non-act violation. We're going to be learning about shituf. Shituf means not completely rejecting God, but adding a partner or a divine partner to God, which is asur. We're going to learn about a little bit about Christianity. There's a very important Tosfos on Daf Samach Gimel Amid Beis, as we learn today's daf. And we're going to learn other rules for which, even when there is a violation of a law, the person won't be punished in a Beis Din. For example, something that's called a lav shebeklalos, which means a generalized prohibition. There are certain times that Hashem says, "Thou shalt not," but that the interpretation of that verse is many. And all of them may not be done, but anyone who, God forbid, does any of them, they won't be chayiv chatos. We're going to learn another rule that whenever after a violation happens, the Torah tells you how to rectify it by doing something positive. For example, don't leave the meat of kachim overnight. But if you left it overnight, burn it. So we say that ba hakasav litan asay achalois aseh loymar she'ein loiken olav. We're going to learn another statement that a person is not allowed to make a partner with an akum. Again, that will be the Tosfos that speaks about nowadays Christians, nowadays meaning already hundreds of years ago in the times of Tosfos. The reason is because if they will feel that they're being challenged as to whether they're saying the truth or not, in business related, I owe money, I don't owe the money, I borrowed, I bought, I sold, many people would take an oath, and the akum might take an oath b'shem his getchkin, b'shem his avodah zarah. And therefore, we somehow cause the name of that avodah zarah to be mentioned, which is something that we may not do. And we'll see the Tosfos that holds that nowadays, even though people go with the name of a Catholic or a Christian, unless you know that to be otherwise, we don't consider that a problem, as we'll learn the Tosfos, similar to what we're going to have in the beginning of Masechtas Avodah Zarah, all of the laws that we learned, right, that 3 days before their holiday, you can't do transactions with them. The idea that for the majority of the Goyim, at least in France or in Europe, here in Western Europe, in the times of Tosfos, it became just like a tradition, and they weren't real believers in their religion, which makes some of the prohibitions that we'll learn about today no longer halachically relevant. We're also going to learn another important rule. We cannot mention the name of an idol unless that name is mentioned in the Torah. In other words, kol avodah zarah haksuva b'Torah mutar lahaskir shema. And we're going to go into various idol worship practices that existed in the days of old. And finally, we should get there. The Gemara is going to make the most beautiful statement that Yoidin Hoyu Yisrael Ba'avodas Kichavim She'ein Ba Mamash. that the Yidden never got that involved in Avodas Kechavim, that they really gave the power to it, or they believed in it, even though we'll see that at times there was a failing in this serious mitzvah. But frat before, as we learned in Yuma, that Daf Ayin Test, that during the beginnings of Ezra's building of the second Beis Hamikdash, at some point we fasted for 72 hours and we succeeded in getting rid of the taiva for Avodah Zarah, which is why we Bechlal cannot relate to the issue over here. And so many times the Torah says don't do it. They had a big taiva, but even during that times, even when there was a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, still Chazal say that Yoidin Chodu Yisrael Avodas Kechavim She'ein Boi Mamish and much more. So again, let's start Mamish at the end of Daf Samach Beis. The last word, Gufa, Daf Samach Gimel. Amar Rabbi Ami, Zibech, a person slaughtered to an idol, and Kiter, they burned something for an idol, and Nisech, they poured something for an idol. The Helam Echad, in one lapse of unawareness, and then they become aware, Oy Gevalt, right? This was Avodah Zarah worship, Ein Achayim, only one Chatos. Oh, Amar Abaye, my Talmud Rav Ami, why is that? Because Amar Kram, Loisa of them, since all of these detailed acts of worship are included in this general statement of thou shalt not worship it, so since they are included in one generalized law, even if a person did various acts of service, behelamachas, the only chayiv one, that hakosuv asa'on kulam avoida achas. Let's call this is called a collective prohibition. So says Abai. Now we had a big problem. We quoted that on Daf Samach Beis. Abai is the one that speaks about the three ishtachavos. Abai agrees to that. He asked, why does the Torah have to write 3 times regarding hishtachava for an idol? Look inside the Rashi, 8 times from the top of the Amid. Where do we find this 3 times? Number 1 in the 10 Commandments. It says lo hishtachava lahem. Rashi is quoting the Aseres HaDibros of Parshas Yisro. Number 2, in Parshas Ki Sisa, it says Ki lo hishtachava le'el acher. And number 3 is going out of the order. Parshas Mishpatim lo hishtachava le'lo yehem. By the way, Rashi adds, why don't we say there's a 4th? Because when the Torah records again the Aseres HaDibros and Parshas Bo Eschanan, there again the Torah writes lo hishtachava le'el acher. So Rashi gives us a very important klal that even though we know that there are some nuanced differences between the Aseres HaDibros in Yisrael versus the Aseres HaDibros in Bo Eschanan, yeah, so we focus on the differences. But wherever the words are the same verbatim, they are considered one. So that's considered one, the lo hishtachava of the Aseres HaDibros. But why did the Torah have to write it 3 times? Back in the Gemara, achas lekedarko, we'll unpack it just in a moment. Va'achas l'shaloi kedarko, and va'achas l'chalik. That will be the key. Va'achas l'chalik means that if mamash like by Shabbos, that if we said that if a person had zudoin Shabbos, shigagas malachas, the chayiv al kolachas va'achas, even though it was behelam echad. Same thing over here. Answers the Gemara. Abaye was only explaining the reason of Rav Ami. Now, why does Rav Ami say you're only chayiv 1? Because since you have this collective prohibition, that's why you're only chayiv 1. The dvar of the Rav Ami common, but the lay to him Abaya lo yisfir, because Abaya teaches 1/3 lo yishtachava to tell you that we are mechalik. And again, that was the whole sugya that we learned on Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph, how the Gemara made it clear that that will be true l'kula alma. To the point that Rabbi Avraham certainly disagrees with Rav Ami as Abaya, but to the point that Rabbi Avraham did not even allow for someone to quote a Tana that says it can't be. Okay, go. Amar Abaya, shalosh ishtachavois v'averes kechavim lama. And we said before, Abaya explained, one is to tell you lechedarko, va'achas shaloi kedarko. And the 3rd one, which is our topic, is lechalek for various chatois, even though it was behelamachas. Ask the Gemara, we are already in the heart of the sugya. What did we learn just a few daf ago? That on Parshas Ze'eh, when the Torah says that we're going to enter the Holy Land, and we're going to see what the Goyim are doing and how they're doing these idol worships. And we, God forbid, might say that Eicha Yavdu HaGoyim Ha'ela. and the pasuk concludes the Esa Chen Gam Oni, and God says, God forbid, don't do that. In other words, and that is the source that the Gemara said above, is that any specific practice of idol worship that the goyim are doing to whichever getchke they're doing it to is something for which we may not do. That's called kedarka. That is everything, including if they bow down to an idol, then that is something that we may not do to that idol. So the kedarka, you don't even need one loisishtachava. Answers the Gemara first that Abaye taich kedarka, he meant it's both kedarka and shaloi kedarka, which means that if there is an idol, people did not worship it by bowing down. If they worship it for bowing down, that's an echayav. They worshipped it in another respectful way. If a person bows down to it, how do you know that they're chayiv? Because of this, but it's similar, meaning that even though it's not the kedarka of that avodah zarah, but it's similar to the fact that they worship it in a respectful way, and bowing is called a respectful act. The next which is telling you that refers to an avodah zarah that's worshipped only through degrading acts, like the Baal Po'ed. And here a person bowed down to it. Here you would think, oh, here you're not chayiv at all, because you did actually a respectful act of worship. That's why you need the second one for. And the third one is like we mentioned, l'chal. This concludes this whole back and forth that we began on Daf Samach Beis with the l'chalik when it comes to idols. And now we're going back to the Mishnah on Daf Samach Beis. Oh, it's good to see a face over here. That the Mishnah writes that hamakabli all of the Eloha, or if a person just says Eliata, the chayiv mis. So that's a big statement. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Baravu, Amar Rav, Kiven she'amar loy Eliata. If a person tells an idol, "You are my God," meaning he doesn't actually worship it. He doesn't do anything other than just making the statement. He's already chayiv misa. Now, by the way, that's what the Mishnah says, which is a problem. Why do I need Rav to repeat what it says in the Mishnah? It says in Lamai, Ilo Katala, chayiv meaning that if you did so, b'mezid with forewarning that you chayiv, skila, that's our Mishnah. Elot must mean what the Mishnah is not discussing. When you did that b'shoigeg, you didn't know that you may not do it. And it then will be that you chayiv echatos, elo lekarbin. But here we got a problem. Really, now the Gemara is making an amazing link. I know that the topic here is saying to an idol, "You are my God." But it's doing something only verbal. Similar is blaspheming, megadev. Now, there is a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva. The source, the ground zero, that Rashi quotes is Mesechtas Krisus, Daf Zayin, regarding megadev. That the Chachamim hold that megadev, you don't bring a carbon because blasphemy. In other words, everyone holds again megadev b'mezid is a chiyuv mis. The question is, doing it b'shoigeg, are you chayiv chatos? Machloikes tanoi. Why? Because it's ein by maisa. So the Gemara is saying that just like by megadev we have that machloikes, lechuura that machloikes should be here as well. When Rav is saying that if a person says to a idol Eliata b'shoigeg the chayiv chatos, asks the Gemara, will that be true even according to the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan hold that by megadev you won't be chayiv chatos. The Hatanya that ein chayiv elo al davar sheyesh by maisen. When you chayiv chatos for avodah zarah only if you did an act which is zibuach, kitur, nisuch and ishtachava, even bowing down is kol ha'maisa. And v'amar ishlakish man tana ishtachava now ishtachava is, you can argue, is a greater act than speech, but it's not an act like shechting an animal or like burning something for an avodah zarah. And when it comes to that statement, Reish Lakish says, that only follows Rabbi Akiva that says you don't need a maisa when it comes to megadev. In other words, Reish Lakish is basically saying in between the lines that according to the Rabbanan, even bowing down b'shoigeg won't bring about a chatos. And Rav is saying, and Rav did not say only Rabbi Akiva. Rav is saying that L'kula Alma, by saying Eliyata, you will be chayiv chatos. So indeed, the Gemara says, you're right. That Kiko Amar Rav Nami, only according to Rabbi Akiva Amar. The Gemara says, if Rav was only following Shitas Rabbi Akiva Pshita, Hainu Megadev, even though it's not really the same, but it's similar to Megadev that it's without a Maisa. So answers the Gemara, no. Now the Tamer one would have argued that because since the Torah explicitly writes that for an act of blaspheming, b'mezid v'chayiv kares, that's the whole beginning of Masechtas Krisus. That's the klal. Any violation for which b'mezid kares b'shogeg chayiv chatas. Masha'inkin over here, when it comes to saying the words Eli Ato, nowhere does the Torah write explicitly that you're chayiv kares. So like Sivei Kares, you might have thought that even L'Rabbi Akiva loy Komash Milan, that you are L'Rabbi Akiva chayiv chatas. The question is why taka? Maybe you're not chayiv kares. So the Gemara says because the itkushe atkush, because we find a hekesh in the Torah regarding bowing, regarding shechting, and regarding just saying to an idol, "You're my God." We're by the idol. The Chsiv says by Yishtach V'Loi Parshas Kisis that a few people bow down to it, and Vayizbuchuloi, and they shechted to it. Vayoimru. What did they say? They say Eila Elohecha Yisrael Asher He'elucha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. So here the Torah juxtaposes that just speaking is like an action, and therefore Kares, and therefore L'Rabbi Akiva doesn't need the Maisa. You're going to be Chayv Chatos B'Shogeg, and that's the Chiddush of Rav. Now that we spoke about the terrible mistake of the ego, what was the declaration that those people made? They said that these are your gods, Yisrael, who brought you up from Mitzrayim. Now, who brought you up, just to note, in Lashon HaKodesh, He'elcha, in the singular, He'elucha, that they brought you up. In other words, the people that got involved in the Egel Hazov were not saying that the Egel Hazov by itself is the God, the only one. It together with God brought you up. Now, does that make their idol worship better or worse? Think about that. In other words, if a person completely denies God, only attributes divinity to an idol, is that a graver avodah zarah worship? Or if someone says that you, God, and another power together brought you out of Mitzrayim, machlikas tanoim. We say we're following this.
So they basically said God has a partner in this case.
That's what Rabbi Yechanan understands. And Rabbi Yechanan says that giving a partner to God is less severe than completely taking God out of the equation. And even though we were punished, but if not for the letter Vav, which made the statement into plural, which only made it, according to him, as giving God a partner, if not for that, if he would have completely only said regarding the idol, you brought the Jewish people out of Egypt, then we would have gotten annihilated. Then the punishment would have been even worse. That those wicked people who got involved in that sin, they would have been completely exterminated. They would have had kiliyam. And this concept that giving God a partner is less serious than completely taking God out of the equation is not according to everyone, but it's subject to a machlokes tanoim. Like we have here from Rabbi Yechanan, however, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai mamish has the opposite opinion. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, haloi, behold, you're wrong. Whoever combines, whoever gives a partner to God, even to God, but with someone else, then that person is completely uprooted from the world. And where do we see that from? In the pasuk that we just used a few daf ago, right? Elohim Yacharam, right? That's speaking about whoever slaughters to a getchke, to a god with a little g, will be Yacharam, Chayiv Misa. The pasuk continues, Bilti Lashem Levadoi, only to God. Only to God. In other words, God and something else with God as a koyach of divine is even a worse sin. Elo. So first of all, according to the Rashbi, when they told the Egel Azav that Eloi Lehecha Yisrael Shehe'elucha, they didn't mean that God and the calf took us out of Egypt. That would have been even worse. That would have been worse. What happened over there is that once they gave themselves over to the Avodah Zarah of the calf, they also remembered other gods in Egypt. Yes, it's plural, but it's not the Emes Oivishter. It's not God Almighty and Lahavdil, the calf. It was the calf and another item. In the plural, that they began to desire many other gods that they had in Egypt. Now, this is a very big statement. This concept, according to the Rashbi, that shituf, which means that God and another being as a God is even worse than completely denying God. Problem is, when it comes, just one example that Tosfos brings in Parshas Chukas, right, that when we spoke against the manna, we complained at a certain time, Hashem sent the fiery serpents and they began to bite people. And when we did tshuva, what did we say? We told Moshe Rabbeinu, Chatanu b'Hashem babach uvach. We sinned against God and you. Because we put Moshe together with God. So why isn't that shituf? So the Tosfos right away says, no. Saying to a tzaddik, to God and to you, that's not called shituf because we're not attributing divinity to the tzaddik. That's different. We are allowed in the same sentence to speak about God and a tzaddik. Es Hashem Elokecha Tina, es l'rabbis Talmidei Chachamim, in the same sentence. What is asur is to have shituf of having God and another divine partner. That, according to the Rashbi, is even worse. Wow, than completely denying God. Now, this leads us into.
How do we know Jews did not attribute divinity to Moshe Rabbeinu, the ones who?
They did not. And there's a beautiful marsha over here that actually says that if you know Parshas Kisisa, I'm going quickly to the Chedushei Agados, and Moshe, right after the record of the great sin, right, which is Sheni of Parshas Kisisa, so we have the Re'ei Ato, we have in the pasuk that you told me, Moshe Rabbeinu tells God, you told me. His point is that don't be so upset at them, because just like it was okay for us to honor Moshe as we did, but Moshe was honored as the manig, as the leader appointed by God to lead us out of Egypt. So Moshe Rabbeinu was arguing that all the Yidden thought regarding the Egel, that the Egel is now the new leader. That was his defense. And that's the way it is, that we have tzaddikim. Hasidim have a Rebbe, but that's and not only that, you can put it in the same sentence. Bashem ubach, vayaminu Bashem in the same sentence. Uba Moshe Avdoi. Shituf, which is two parts of God, according to the Rashbi, is worse than Avodah Zarah. And I want you to know that leads us into Christianity. I'm not the expert in Christianity, and could be there are different theologies in Christianity. Many people who have a little bit of knowledge, which is always not good. For Jews, we are obligated to give up our lives and not, God forbid, to become to connect to any denomination. It's all avodah zarah for a Yid without question. So paskins the Rambam. The big question is, are Goyim allowed to believe in Christianity? Not so. People say, yeah, Goyim are not Mitzuv and Shituf. People don't know what that means clearly. High likely, also Lashita Saramam, that's pure idol worship. And not only that, it might be even worse than denying of God. It might even be worse than the pagans, because this is called Rashbi. You're making two parts to God, and one part is not God, but you're giving divine attribution to it. That's the worst type of avodah zarah. Let's go weiter. Avol, back to the Mishnah. Hamigape, if a person embraces an idol, or hamanashik, if a person kisses an idol, or if a person sweeps the floor in front of an idol, or if a person sprinkles the earth to make the dust settle in front of an idol. In all of these cases, when it shaloi kedarkom, even though you're chayv alav, what's the lav? We began today, loiso avdei. But the Mishnah says you're not going to be chayv misas based. Ki asa Rabdimi Amar Abulazar. That al kulam loika. Lav means you're chayv malchus. But when you chayiv malchus, when you didn't act again, when a person embraced, a person swept the floor. But if it's only words, which is another case mentioned in the Mishnah, which is someone who takes a vow in the name of an avodah zarah, hamakayim, let's interpret hamakayim, you swore in the name of an avodah zarah, then you're not even going to get malchus. You're violating the law, but you're not going to be chayiv malchus. Asks the Gemara, he quoted Rabbi Elazar, the Amoyre from Eretz Yisrael, right? The contemporary of Rabbi Avraham Zajac. What will be the argument? Because to have a leilav she'im by ma'aseh, that this ground zero of this topic is that we're going to have this in Masechta Makis. Is that in Parshas Kiseitze, right after the Torah speaks about Makis, the one time Arboim Yakenu, right after that the Torah writes Loisachsoim Shoyer B'disha. Don't muzzle a shoyer when it's threshing. Muzzling is something that you do. So Chazal learn it's really a subject to Machlokes Tanoi. But this opinion holds that only if you did something that's violating a law do you get the Arboim Yarkenu. Arboim really means 39. But if the violation was through a non-action, like saying words, again, our sugyas following that Akimas Sfosov is not called a Maisa. Well, if that will be the reason, asks the Gemara, well, Haninami, the embracing, the kissing, Hamachabe, is also allowed for which you should not be chayiv malchus because of another rule. What's the other rule? It's known as lav shebeklalus, any generalized prohibition, any statement in the Torah that becomes a umbrella injunction. That means that God writes a one-liner, thou shalt not, X, Y, and Z. And Chazal say it means many things. If it means many things, then you may not do any of them. Midoiraisa, but there'll never be malchus. Malchus is only if that lav is referring specifically to one violation. And again, loisa avdein is a very general statement. It's an umbrella injunction. It means everything that we mentioned. Everything that we mentioned. So why should you get malchus? Now, where do we learn that you don't get malchus for a lav shabaklos? The aim like in a lav shabaklos, dear Tanya, listen to this. Minayin. How do you know that if a person eats meat from an animal, while it's still thrashing about? Now, the moment you shecht an animal, we'll learn in Chulin, there is no more Ever Menachai for a Jew. Nevertheless, you may not eat from the animal while it's still thrashing about. We're not even talking about the Isur of Dam, because it's possible that if you cut a piece of the meat and you wash the blood off from the outside of it, from its periphery, if it wasn't cooked, which means the blood that is still in there, animal wasn't salted yet, is exactly where it was naturally, it's not called dam yet. We'll learn about that in Chulin with greater detail. Nevertheless, you can't eat this meat. And you know what? According to this opinion, you're violating a law. How do you know that? Because it says in Parshas Kedoshim, Lo yiseichlu al adam. I want you to know the pshat of this pasuk, L'seichlu al adam. Here in Kedoshim, we're speaking also about a lot of the acts of sorcery that may not be done. People that practice sorcery, many a time, they would gather blood in a pit. And with their understanding that demons are attracted to blood. And they would eat near that pit. With the kavanah that all these demonic forces that are attracted to the blood, they're eating near that gathering of blood, will, so to say, reveal themselves to the eaters and they'll find out the future or whatever. That's the pshat. Now listen to how many other prohibitions are all included in this liner. Don't eat over the blood. It means this. Don't eat over the blood means even though you shechted the animal, there's no more Ever Menachai. Blood means there's still life in the animal. The animal is thrashing about. Don't eat. Don't eat from that animal. Another means in the temple, when you shech an animal and the blood is still in its basin, you did not yet do zerika, you may not eat any of the meat. You can only achilas kahanim is only after the matir, which is zerika sadam. Another interpretation. After someone loses one of his or her 7 close relatives and they're buried, there is a su'uda that's called su'udas habra'ah. It's a meal that's dafka bought by others. The minute today is to buy bread and to buy eggs. And the family eats that healing meal. So if someone was chayiv misa in a beis din and beis din executed that person, no one brings a meal to the relatives. How do I know that from? We're just pointing out, it means many things. Rabbi Akiva says another. How do you know that Sanhedrin, that if and when, very rarely it really happened, they put someone to death, on that day they don't taste, they don't eat anything. It's a fast day for them. By the way, it's extended. These are for greater people. That a day that a beis din writes a get, that Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik, had that minute, that if he wrote a get, on that day he fasted. Another statement. Now let's go to Amiroim. Rabbi Yechanan Oimer. Even though a Ben Soider was speaking about when he's robbing people and he's with that money eating tremendous amounts of meat and wine. So he gets malchus for that. This is before he does it again and then he's put to death. And he gets malchus for that we know from the pasuk. But as the rule is that any sin for which you'll be punished in a court, that sin has to be alluded to twice in the Torah. The first of which is God's warning, don't do it. Where does it say not to do it? Another. And now that we learned, I want to give you another limit, that another chazal, that we're not supposed to eat before davening. In other words, what the point is that there are certain statements in the Torah that is like an umbrella injunction. It's a very generalized law. And the rule is that if a person broke any of the above, they broke a biblical, but they're not going to be chayv malchus. Because ein loiken alav shebeklos. Al kulam ein loiken mishum dahavalei alav shebeklos. So now we're going back to our question. The question is, why are we saying that other than hanoider b'shmai, other than hamakayim b'shmai, for megabe, for menashek, the Mishnah says chayiv lav, but he's saying you're chayiv malchus. Why are you chayiv malchus when it's all included in the loisa of the kasher? Ella kiyasod of Amar Abu Lazar. You know, you got the version completely punkt faked. You got it 180 wrong. Al kulam ein loika. For embracing, for kissing, you won't be chayiv malchus. The opposite, only for taking a vow in the name of an idol, for that you will get malchus. Question is again, why? Why is that? Now, I understand. Now we understand. Why did Rabbi Lazar say in this updated version that there's no chiyuv malchus for worshiping idols, right? We're speaking about the worships that are shaloi kedarka, and they're not one of the four, because the haninami noide b'shmoi, the kayim b'shmoi should not bring about a chiyuv. For another reason, it's lafsha ein boy ma'isa. As we just had above, more answers. Not everyone subscribes to lafsha ein boy ma'isa ein like an olive. That is a machlokes tanoim. Hahu kidder Rabbi Yehuda. The Omar, the Tana Rabbi Yehuda holds lafsha ein boy ma'isa. Yes, like an olive. Where do we find that? We find that Korban Pesach, when the Torah writes in Parshas Boy, the first Korban Pesach, and subsequently all of the Korbanos Pesach, that when we shech the Korban, we must finish eating it either until midnight or until the morning, midoiraisa. And the Torah says, don't leave over any of the meat for the morning. Then the Torah says that don't leave it over until the morning. And then the Torah says, burn it. Now, what happens if someone left the meat over? Leaving meat over is done through a non-action. Are you chayiv malchus? So everyone holds you're not chayiv malchus. The question is, why are you not chayiv malchus? So here, the first Tana, Rabbi Yehuda says that the Torah, by telling you how to rectify the sin, burn it if you left some of the meat over. Why do we learn from that? Asay, which means if not for this reason, you would be chayiv malchus. Is a raya that Rabbi Yehuda holds that you chayiv malchus even for a lav she'ein boy mais. However, Rabbi Yaakov Oimer Hashem uzeh You're right that you're not Chayiv Malkus, but you know why? Better, because it's a lav she'ein by Maisa. And b'chol lav she'ein by Maisa ain't like an olive. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with Rabbi Yaakov. You know why? Mechal Rabbi Yehuda Savar, yes, like an olive. Now hold on. I'm good. So now that we have a Tana that holds that even when there is no Maisa, like an olive, but why Hanoider b'shmoi Malkis? Why isn't this a lav shabachlalus? It's not a lav shabachlalus, as we'll learn right now. That there's a specific lav regarding noider b'shmoi. Noider b'shmoi, hamakayim b'shmoi, a vow or an oath in the name of an idol is a violation of a lav. Noider b'shmoi, hamakayim b'shmoi, says the Gemara Minolan. What's the source? What's the pasuk? The Tanya, when it says in the 10 Commandments, the Shem Elohim Achedim Lo Yisaskiru. No. This is a pasuk in Mishpatim. I'm sorry, pasuk in Mishpatim. The Shem Elohim Achedim don't mention. Meaning, Shelo Yomer Adam Lachaveiroi Shmor Li B'Tzad Averis Gacham Pleinis. Not to mention means, let's say there's a church, and you want to use that as a point of reference. When you see the church, make a left turn. You're not even allowed to say that. In our case, if you want to hide something near an idol and tell you it's near that idol, don't even mention Hashem Averis Gacham. Then it says,
sorry. So walking into a church is under the whole umbrella of not bowing to an idol, or is it basically a law?
Just to clarify, walking into the sanctuary of a church is something that's biblically forbidden. Walking inside the property of a church is not, but walking inside their sanctuary is mamish also deraisa. A church, yaharig val yav. Yaharig, a person should die and not do it. Right. Then when it says it shall not be heard through you, means two things. Number one, about our topic, don't in the name of that, a person says, I make a vow or I swear. And also it says lo yishama al picham, not lo yishama from your mouth. It should not be heard through your mouth. What does that mean? Don't do anything that might cause another to take a vow in their idol, or for them to swear in their idol. As we'll see in a moment, having a partnership with a religious guy before the Tosfos. When you have a partnership with someone, it's sooner or later where there's going to be an issue between the partners, and one partner, to authenticate their words, will swear in the name of their God. So if that person is an idol worshiper, he might end up swearing in the name of his God. So don't even enter in a partnership with him. That's the forewarning in the Torah. Again, everything that the Torah speaks about with the punishment has to have one verse that just says, thou shalt not do, both for the maces, for the instigator in Parshas Re'eh, and for the Madiach, for the subverter of an entire city. The Gemara says, hold on, no, for the maces, you're wrong. Maces behedek sivei, b'chol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro, v'lo yosifu lasos. V'lo yosifu lasos, that's a warning. Indeed, this pasuk is also the azara for the Madiach. And coming back to the Brais, we can't do anything that will cause others to take a vow in the name of their idol, or or to take an oath in the name of their idol. Says the Gemara, this Brais is the source to that which the father of Shmuel taught. The Amar Avuah de Shmuel, a Yid may not make even a partnership with an idol worshiper, because maybe he'll be chayiv to swear to the Jew. And when he'll take an oath, he's going to swear in the name of his God. And that's in violation. You should have had that foresight. Well, now before we go on, which will be a mamash agadata, look inside the second, which is also the last Tosfos in the Amud, because it's clear that avodas kechavim is referring to Christians. So what happened in Europe? But you can't have a partnership with a goy because he might take an oath in the name of his God. So I want to read. I'm reading already in the middle of the Tosfos. This is Shitas Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says that this man has said that nowadays, in his days, kulam nishboim b'kachim shalahem. These Christians, they keep on evoking, Yashke. They evoke the name of their God, but they ain't but they don't really attribute divinity to it. In other words, it became, unless you know for that individual to be a religious individual, for the Amcha, even though they say that they are part of that religion, when they say that word, it's more a cultural and it's not a religious. And therefore, he was mated. One thing is clear from our Tosfos, that even if he would be religious, again, going back to Shituf, even though, again, I'm not the expert in Christianity, but the Trinity, even for a goy, is avodah zarah, because it's being mishtatev, another being noch with God. The type of shituf that maybe, according to some opinions, goyim can subscribe to is if they would accept that there's one God, and that God delegated certain responsibilities to like servants, like to the stars, to the moon. Karolei elokada elokaya. That is something that maybe for goyim is not called avodah zarah, as long as they know that there is like the super God, but they also give cover to the sun and to the moon because God, they think in their mistake, delegated powers to them. That's not Christianity. They mamish partner Yashka with God. The only reason why, again, that Rabbeinu Tam says nowadays a person can have a partner with a Christian is because they don't really mean it. And let's go right. Now, okay, also, Ula, this is how far we have to keep away from idol worship. Once Ula came to Bavel, Ula kept on going back and forth, and Bus, he overnighted, he spent night, Calif. Calif is the name of a city, but Calif is a city that was named after an idol. And what happened was, the issue was not to sleep in such a city if it was named after an idol, but can you say the name of the city? He found Ula, he said, where did you sleep last night? So he responded, he just quoted the name of the city. So Rabbi tells Ula, how can you even say that? Don't even mention the name of an idol. So Amalei, to which Ula responds, this is what Rabbi Yechanan taught. The first wide line. If the name is mentioned in the Torah, then you could mention its name. And where do you have the Kal Nevoy mentioned in the Torah? So he answered, and says in Yeshaya, concerning us mocking their idols, that Korah Baal squats, and Koides Nevoy, and the voice splashes. Nevoy is an avodah zarah. And this is connected, like we said, to the Baal Pa'or, that they used to worship it by doing dafka, very disrespectful act of defecating in front of it. And we would say, Taka, the idol itself is splashing and squatting. And we'll get off track for a moment to say that even though we have to be very careful how we speak, not regarding idols, that we can say lutzanes and we can use expressions that are otherwise not to be used. But since we find nevoy mentioned in Yeshaya, kal nevoy, that's the same idol. That's why we can say it. Don't forget that Ula was not, he just quoted the name of the city. But if that name would not have been mentioned in the Torah, then we would not even be allowed to say the name of a city named after an idol.
Like Simcha Monica?
No, it's not. First of all, it's good to say Simcha Monica, but in New Zealand, there's a town called something with Yoshka, or something with. Come to me. It doesn't have to come to me. Something with Yoshka Pandrik. Maybe you cannot even say the name of the city. Now, Gemara, two lines into the wide lines. Why? No, how can that be? Must have done a sharshir. It says in the Mishnah is speaking about a zav, someone who has this gonorrhea or this unnatural seminal emission. If he has it once, if he has it twice, if he has it 3 times, how the law changes. And then the Mishnah is speaking about a scenario where someone had 1 emission, but it took a long time, the time that it should have taken for 3. Does it have a din of 1? Does it have a din of 3? Says the Mishnah, the person had 1 very long zav emission, but it was meruba kishaloish. It was physically flowing out of his body in the time halachically of 3. How do we define that? How long is that? So the Mishnah gives 2 ways of defining that time. Number 1, the time that it takes to go from Megadion is an idol. And it was a name called by the idol. Here again, we have the problem. To Shiloi, or to the Shiluach, which is also, says the Mishnah, the time it would take a person to have an emission, to go to the mikveh, to dry oneself, another emission to dry oneself. The kids are having 3 emissions, and in between going to the mikveh twice, which means undressing and going to the mikveh and drying your body and redressing. That's another way of just quantifying the time of 3. So the Mishnah Paskins, that's taka considered 3. The problem is the Mishnah uses as a means of measuring time Megadyon. Megadyon is an idol. Answers the Gemara Amar Avina. Gadyon is God. Another pasuk where we find in Yeshaya when the pasuk writes those who set their tables for the idol called God. How ironic is it? But that's in a good way that God in Balaz is speaking to Hashem Echad with a capital G. But the Goyim then had an Avodah Zarah that was called God. So here again, it's a fact that the pasuk mentions the name of that idol that allows us to use it, not mentioning their God, mentioning the name of a city that was named after the God. Okay. Omar Rav Nachman. We're getting a little bit off, but also concerning these psukim regarding Avodah Zarah. Kol nitzei nusa asira. We have to be very careful never to speak in mocking words. It's having a clean mouth is that important, and speaking uncleanly is not okay, aside of leitsanus that we make regarding a idol. That is not allowed. And now we're quoting the psukim we had before, that we explained, that it says, Kora bal, koires nevoy bal squats, nevoy splashes, not clean to speak that way. But that was the chayzik we were making of the idol. Or another pasuk where it says that karsu karu yachtov, that together they splash and squat. Lo yochlu malat masa, they were unable to hold in their burden. These are making lutzanes of their avodah zarah. Or it says elsewhere, dibru leeglois base oven were the caps that were made out of copper, and they were put, Yeravim ben Avat put one in Dad, in Beis El, he put another one in Chelkoi Sholdan. So the pasuk says, speak, right? Because of the eglois base oven. Your guru, Shach and Shemim, the people that lived in Shemim were afraid, Ki aval olav amai, because we're speaking about a time where these avodah zaros were taken away. So the people felt they lost their protection. But the pasuk is making fun of that idol, that the priests of these calves, they were happy. They rejoiced that they no longer needed to worship those idols. Ki kavoida al kavoida, because of kavoida means because of its honor. Ki gila mimenu, because it was taken away. So why were they happy? Because its honor was taken away. So Chazal explained, no. That al tikra kavoida el kavoida. They were happy because the heaviness of these idols that they defecated a lot was taken away. They didn't need it to be connected with the defecation of these idols. The truth is, these idols were images, were made out of metals, but beruchnius, they defecate, they make shmutzik. You just see that Chazal used this type of verbiage, which is normally something that we may never use, because they were speaking about an avodah zarah. And Amar Rabbi Yitzchak might have said, there we're speaking about many generations after these idols were set up, these images of calves were placed in Beis El and in Dan. In the times of Yehu, they actually began to worship physical animals. And the pasuk writes that this is an additional sin. And vayasu lahem masech mikasavim, that they made from their silver, they made also images of these animals. Ketvunam atzavim, shapes of their idols. Says the Gemara, what does it mean? My ketvunam atzavim, what type of shapes did they make? The Lamed, during the times of Yehu, when people steeped more into idol worship, everyone had their own private getchkela that they would always carry with them. And whenever they thought about their idol, they would take it out of the bosom, they would hug it, they would kiss it. And what's the meaning of the pasuk over there? That zoifchei adam agolim yishakum, those who slaughter people, will kiss the calves. What does that refer to? Amar Yitzchak, the Veid Avami, quoting a brisa that was taught in the Shiva of Avami, all about different types of idol worships. That shahoyu mishar se'avaris kichavim. whenever the priests of these idols, they began to worship physical animals, and everyone made little images of those animals. And look at the cruelty and the greed of the priests of those pagan worshipers. And that is that if they saw someone that's wealthy and they wanted to acquire their wealth, so this is how they got those people to allow themselves to become human sacrifices, after which the priest would take away their wealth. This is what they did. So the people then, they would worship an animal. What did the priests do? They would make sure these animals lack food. They would starve these animals. They would starve the calves. And the calves would be going to the trough the whole time looking for food. They would put pictures of these wealthy people by those troughs. So when the calves were there constantly looking for food, they would every day see an image. They had paintings, they didn't have pictures of those people. The calves, animals can become familiar with the form of a specific individual. They would make images of those wealthy people. And they would put it near the troughs. In other words, the calves that people worshipped as a god would become familiar with the image, with the face of those wealthy chevra. Whenever the wealthy people would come into that location, so the priests would let these Avodah Zarah calves loose, and they would naturally go near the wealthy people. And then the priest would say, wow, the gods want you. Why don't you offer yourself for them? And they would let them go free. And whenever these calves would see these balabatim, which were wealthy, naturally they would run after them because they were familiar with their image. They would nuzzle them. And therefore, the priests would tell these wealthy people who the idol wants you. So why not? Why don't you offer yourself as a sacrifice to them, which they did? It was peer pressure. And then the kohanim took their money. So says Rabbi, if that would be the meaning of this pasuk of Zoifchei Adam Hagolim Yishakum, those who slaughter people will kiss the calves, the pasuk should have been written on the opposite seder. Hi, Zoifchei Adam Hagolim Yishakum. No, the pasuk should have written Hagolim Yishakum is Bayach Adam, that they would make the calves kiss people, and that would get them to have those people sacrifice themselves. So that's not what the pasuk is referring to. Whoever would slaughter, look what they did. They told people, if you're going to sacrifice your son to an idol, then we'll allow you to kiss the idol. Imagine that the taiva that they had was so big to kiss the idol that they would sacrifice their children. So Amar Loi, therefore, since you gave your child to an avodah zarah, you can kiss it, and that is what the prophet is lamenting, that people stoop down to the level that zoifchei adam in order to be able to be a golem yishakum. I want you to know the Anshe Babel people in Babylonia also, they would make different images. They would make it sukkos banos. What image is sukkos banos? Maninu tarnagolos. They would make an image of a hen. They would have actually an image of a hen hovering over the chicklets. That would be the image of the avodah zarah. The people, of course, would make an image of a nargol. What's the nargol? A rooster. Different other. They made this one made a hen. This one made a rooster. The people of Hamas also as Ashima. They would make an image of a Yashima. Asks the Maramayinu, what was that image? Barcha Karcha, a billy goat, a bull goat. The Ha'avim, the nations, the Avims, they made an image of a Nafchan and of a Tartok. What is a Nafchan and a Tartok? Taichas the Gemara, Nafchan means a barker, a dog. They made the dog as their avodah zarah. Tartok means a chamoy. The next nation, the Has Farvim, they would worship idols by burning their sons or daughters in fire to their idol that they called Adar Melech, and to another idol called Ana Melech, who is the Elohei Staf Ravim. Says the Gemara, what is these two getchkes? Adar Melech is a parrot, is a mule, and Ana Melech is a horse. Why were they given these names? Adar Melech, a mule, because the Adar Leimare, a mule is a creature that honors its master by offering itself to be the beast of burden. And the Ana Melech, which is a horse, why is it called Ana Melech? Because even in a war, a horse is so devoted to its owner that it goes forth into battle. And they made little getchkelech of horses. Av Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, speaking about people at that time that would mamish offer human beings and sometimes their own children as a sacrifice to their gods. The father of Chizkiyahu, like Melech Achaz, who was a wicked king, who was a big Oged Avodah Zarah, he actually burned Chizkiyahu to an idol. He wanted to offer his child. So how did Chizkiyahu survive it? We're going to learn, and we learned at the end of Chagiga, the end of Chagiga of Chav Zayin, that if you have a fire that's burning straight for 7 years, this mythical creature that we called a salamandra goes out of the fire. If you can capture that and take its blood makes the person who has the blood smeared on their body immune from fire. So the wife of Achaz, knowing what type of Oved Avodah Zarah is her husband, she was afraid that she might offer one of her children to Avodah Zarah. She protected Chizkiyahu with the fire. And Al Pi Ruchnius, fire is Yiddishkeit and Torah and mitzvahs. Right? Eish oicheles, that what protects us from the shtuyot of this world, that is also burning up ourselves and our children to Avodah Zarah, is by smearing ourselves 7 years. 7 years is maybe people learn Daf Hayomi. It takes 7 years to learn it. You got to be completely immersed in Torah. We're going to stop over here. And that protects us from the unhealthy fires of the world. To be continued. Wow. Okay, we fell behind, but we're going to run tomorrow.
Thank
Tomorrow
you,
morning, 6 o'clock.